through the drowning dark. The water was everywhere, cold and absolute, filling Isaiah's nose and mouth, dragging him down into blind darkness. Hannah's hand was torn from his grip by the current's violence, and for one terrible moment he was alone in the rushing void, tumbling end over end with no sense of up or down, his lungs already screaming for air. He slammed into something hard, rock or wood. He couldn't tell, and the impact drove what little air remained from his chest. His hands scrabbled against stone, found nothing to grip, and then the current seized him again and pulled him deeper into the underground river's throat. Hannah. The thought cut through his panic like a blade. He forced himself to stop fighting, to let the current carry him, conserving what remained of his strength. The water was moving fast, faster than any creek or river he'd ever swum, and the darkness was so complete, he might as well have been blind. His shoulders scraped against something, the passage wall, and he reached out instinctively, trying to slow himself, to find some purchase. His fingers found a gap in the rock, barely wide enough for his hand, and he clung to it desperately as the current tried to tear him loose. He pulled his head above water and gasped, dragging air into his burning lungs. The sound of the water was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off invisible walls. He couldn't hear anything else, not voices, not splashing, nothing to tell him if the others had made it through or if they'd all drowned in the first few seconds of this desperate gamble. "Hannah!" He tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the roar of water. Moses! Anyone! Nothing. Just the endless rush of the current and his own ragged breathing in the dark. He couldn't stay here. The cold was already seeping into his bones, and his grip on the rock was weakening. He had to keep moving, had to trust that the others were somewhere ahead in this flooded tunnel, that Friend Patterson's desperate plan hadn't just killed them all. Isaiah let go. The current took him immediately, faster now, and he forced himself to keep his arms in front of his face to protect against unseen obstacles. The passage seemed to be sloping downward, the water picking up speed, and then suddenly there was air above him, more space, the sound changing as the tunnel opened up. He surfaced, gasping, and this time when he reached out his hands found not rock but something else, wood, rough and splintered. A log or branch caught in the current. He grabbed it with both hands and held on, letting it carry him, using it as a float to keep his head above water. The darkness was less absolute now. Somewhere ahead? How far? He couldn't tell. There was a faint gray light, barely more than a suggestion of illumination, but enough to give him hope. The passage was widening, the current spreading out and losing some of its violence. "Isaiah!" The voice was faint, nearly lost in the water's roar, but he heard it. Hannah! She was alive! "I'm here!" he shouted back, though he had no idea if she could hear him. "Keep going! Follow the light!" The log he was clinging to suddenly caught on something and stopped dead, nearly tearing his arms from their sockets. He lost his grip and went under again, tumbling in the current. But this time when he surfaced, he could see more clearly. The gray light was stronger now, and the passage had opened into a wider pool where the current slowed. He swam toward the light with strokes made clumsy by cold and exhaustion. His feet touched bottom, mud and stones, and he half crawled, half swam toward the pale illumination that promised escape from this underground hell. The pool ended at a rocky shelf where water poured down from a gap in the stone above. The gray light was coming from there. Not full daylight, but the pale pre-dawn glow that meant the world still existed somewhere beyond this flooded cave. Isaiah pulled himself onto the shelf, coughing up water, his whole body shaking with cold and reaction. "Isaiah!" He turned and saw Hannah struggling toward him through the current, her face barely visible in the dim light. He crawled back to the edge and reached for her, catching her arm and pulling her up onto the rocks beside him. She collapsed against him, coughing and gasping, and for a long moment they just held each other, breathing, alive. The others? Hannah managed between coughs. "I heard Moses, and someone screaming. I think it was Ruth." "Ruth's awake?" Isaiah's heart sank. The little girl's terror would have been absolute, plunged into dark water without warning. "Where are they?" "I don't know. The current separated us right away. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the water. A splash behind them made them both turn. Samuel surged up from the pool, supporting Elijah with one arm. The girl's face was gray with pain and cold, but she was conscious, gripping her brother's shoulder with desperate strength. Isaiah and Hannah pulled them both onto the shelf. Elijah's ankle was even more swollen now, the flesh tight and hot to the touch despite the cold water. "Abigail?" Isaiah asked. Samuel shook his head, still gasping for breath. "Lost her in the first turn. Current took her a different way." "Moses had Ruth," Elijah said through chattering teeth. "I heard her crying just before we went under. Then nothing." Isaiah looked at the pool, willing more figures to emerge from the dark water. The current was steady but not as violent here, and the light from above was growing stronger as dawn approached. If the others had made it this far, they should be surfacing soon. Unless they hadn't made it at all. Unless the passage had branched somewhere in the darkness and carried them a different direction. Unless they'd been trapped underwater, unable to find air, drowning in the blind dark while Isaiah and the others escaped. No, he couldn't think that way. Moses was strong, and he'd been holding Ruth. Abigail was a survivor. Mercy and Clara had entered the water together, supporting each other. They had to have made it through. They had to. "There!" Hannah pointed at the pool. A figure broke the surface. Clara, alone, her face a mask of terror and exhaustion. She swam toward them with strokes that barely kept her head above water, and Isaiah reached down to pull her out. "Mercy," Clara gasped as soon as she could speak. "I lost her. The current. She couldn't hold on." "Where?" Isaiah demanded, already knowing the answer was useless. In the dark, underwater, distance and direction meant nothing. Clara just shook her head, tears mixing with the water streaming down her face. "I tried. I held on to her as long as I could, but the current was too strong, and she was so weak already. She just slipped away." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of water and their ragged breathing. Mercy, who had declared she would die free rather than enslaved, who had made it through the swamp, through the cave, through everything only to drown in the darkness of an underground river. "Moses," Elijah said suddenly, "listen." They all fell silent. And then Isaiah heard it. A voice. Distant but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere in the flooded passages behind them. "Help! Someone! Abigail." Isaiah was moving before he could think, sliding back into the cold water, swimming toward the voice. Behind him he heard Samuel curse and splash in after him, and then Hannah's voice. "Isaiah, no! You don't know where she is." But he was already diving, following the sound of Abigail's desperate calls, praying he could find her before the cold and exhaustion made swimming impossible. The passage branched ahead of him, and he chose the direction where her voice seemed louder, swimming hard against the current that tried to push him back. He found her clinging to a rock outcropping in a side channel, the water up to her chin, her strength clearly failing. Her face was gray with pain and cold, and when she saw him, the relief in her eyes was almost heartbreaking. "Ruth," she said as he reached her. "Where's Ruth? Did Moses—" "We haven't seen them yet," Isaiah said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "But they're strong. Moses won't let anything happen to her. It was a promise he had no right to make, but he made it anyway because Abigail needed to hear it. Needed something to hold on to besides the rock that was the only thing keeping her from drowning." Samuel reached them a moment later, and together they got Abigail back to the main pool, back to the shelf where the others waited. Hannah had torn strips from her dress to bind Elijah's ankle, though there was little they could do for the infection without proper medicine. The light from above was definitely stronger now, the gray of pre-dawn giving way to the first pale colors of sunrise. Isaiah looked up at the gap in the stone, barely 3 feet wide, water pouring down from it in a small waterfall. Beyond it, he could see tree branches silhouetted against the lightening sky. "We need to get up there," he said. "Find out where we are, see if there's another opening where Moses and the others might come out." The climb was brutal. The rock was slick with water and moss, and every handhold was uncertain. Isaiah went first, finding precarious grips and footholds, pulling himself up inch by inch while cold water poured over his head. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second, his fingers screaming with the strain. But finally he reached the gap and pulled himself through into the gray light of dawn. He was in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. A creek, The same one they'd crossed days ago, he realized, flowed past barely 20 feet away, fed by the spring that created the underground river. The water emerged from a crack in a rocky hillside, tumbling down into the creek in a series of small waterfalls. And there, downstream, where the creek widened into a pool, was Moses. The big man was sitting in the shallows, water up to his waist, and in his arms was Ruth. The little girl was crying, huge, gasping sobs that meant she was alive and breathing, and Moses was holding her against his chest, rocking her gently, murmuring words Isaiah couldn't hear. Relief hit Isaiah so hard he nearly collapsed. He turned back to the gap and called down, "They're here! Moses and Ruth! They're alive!" The sound that came up from below was somewhere between a sob and a prayer. Abigail's voice? "Thank God! Thank you, God! Thank you!" Isaiah helped the others up one by one. Hannah came first, then Samuel supporting Elijah, then Clara, and finally Abigail, who climbed with a desperate strength born of maternal need, despite her cracked ribs and exhaustion. As soon as she was through the gap, she was running, splashing through the creek toward Moses and Ruth. The little girl looked up at the sound, saw her mother, and reached for her with both arms. "Mama?" Abigail took Ruth from Moses' arms and held her so tightly it seemed she would never let go. The child was soaked and shivering, her face streaked with tears, but she was alive. They were both alive. Moses pulled himself out of the water and stood, water streaming from his massive frame. His face was exhausted but peaceful, and when Isaiah met his eyes, the big man just nodded. "The current carried us straight through," Moses said quietly. "Came out in the creek." "Mercy?" Isaiah shook his head. Moses closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was grief there, but also acceptance. "She knew," he said. "Before we went in, she told me she was ready, said she'd rather drown free than die enslaved." "She got her wish," Clara said, her voice rough. "She died free. We all made it out of that cellar, out of that barn, away from those slave catchers. She died free." They stood together in the growing light of dawn, 7 people who had gambled everything on a desperate leap into darkness and survived. 7 instead of 8, but alive, free, together. Isaiah looked around, trying to orient himself. The forest was thick here, the creek providing natural concealment, but they couldn't stay. The slave catchers would find the empty barn soon, would discover the escape route through the spring house, would follow the underground river just as they had. They needed to move, but first, they needed to mark this place, to remember. Isaiah found a flat stone near the creek bank and used a sharp rock to scratch into its surface. Mercy. Died free. 1857. He placed it carefully beside the creek, where the water from the underground river emerged into the light. It wasn't a proper grave, wasn't a proper memorial, but it was something. A marker that said she had existed, that she had mattered, that she had chosen freedom even at the cost of her life. The others gathered around the stone in silence. Ruth had stopped crying and was watching with wide, solemn eyes from the safety of her mother's arms. "She saved us," Hannah said quietly. "Her medicines, her teas, her knowledge. Without her, we never would have made it this far." "She taught me about herbs," Clara said. "Just in the few days we traveled together, said knowledge was freedom too. Something nobody could take away." Moses knelt by the stone and touched it gently. "Go easy, old mother. You earned your rest." Isaiah felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him again. 7 people looking to him for guidance, for hope, for a way forward. 6 now that Mercy was gone, and one of them a 4-year-old child who had just been dragged through an underground river in the dark. They were still 30 miles from the Pennsylvania border, still hunted, still with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the desperate will to keep moving forward. But they were alive. And the morning sun was rising over the trees, painting the sky with colors that promised a new day, a new chance, a new beginning. "The Patterson farm," Isaiah said. "We were supposed to meet there, but that's compromised now. We need to find the next station on the railroad, the next safe house. There's a Quaker meeting house about 10 miles north of here, near a town called Willowbrook. If we can reach it by nightfall—" "If," Samuel interrupted. His face was hard, angry. "If we can walk 10 miles with Elijah barely able to stand, if we don't run into slave catchers, if the Quakers there haven't been warned to watch for us. If. You have a better idea?" Isaiah asked quietly. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it, shook his head. The anger in his face was really fear, Isaiah realized. Fear and exhaustion and the weight of watching his sister suffer. "We keep moving," Moses said, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Same as we've been doing. Same as we'll keep doing until we reach Canada or die trying." Mercy knew that. We all know that. He was right. There was no other choice, no other path. They had committed to this journey when they fled the plantation, had committed again when they plunged into that underground river. The only way forward was forward. Isaiah looked at each of them in turn. Hannah, who met his eyes with fierce determination despite the exhaustion in her face. Abigail, holding Ruth close, her maternal love stronger than any fear. Samuel and Elijah, brother and sister bound by blood and suffering and stubborn refusal to be separated. Clara, who had blackmailed her way into this escape and then held on to mercy until the current tore them apart. Moses, steady as stone, reliable as sunrise, his people, his responsibility, his family, forged not by blood, but by shared suffering and shared hope. "Then we move," Isaiah said. "Stay in the creek for the first mile to hide our scent from dogs. Then we cut northeast through the forest, avoiding roads and farms as much as possible. We travel in pairs, Moses and Ruth with Abigail, Samuel and Elijah together, Clara with Hannah and me. If we get separated, everyone heads for Willowbrook, the Quaker meeting house on the north side of town. White building with a bell tower. Can't miss it." He looked at the sky, judging the time. "Sun's up. Slave catchers will be moving soon if they aren't already. We need to be miles from here before they start searching." They moved out in silence, wading into the creek, heading north. The water was cold, but not as cold as the underground river had been, and the morning sun was already beginning to warm the air. Isaiah took one last look at the stone marker beside the creek, at Mercy's name scratched into rock. She had died free. That was something. That was everything. But the rest of them needed to live free, and that meant moving, always moving, putting distance between themselves and the men who would drag them back to slavery if they could. Isaiah turned his back on the marker and followed his people into the creek, into the forest, into whatever came next. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint baying of hounds. The hunt was not over.
Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures. Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures.